Welcome to Call Your Hits, a Storm Riders Airsoft podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Today, Pat and I are going to be talking about my recent switch from AEGs to HPA, specifically removing the gearbox from my main AEG and replacing it with a Kythera engine, the trials and tribulations of that, where we're at with all of it, and so on. But we're going to get to that in a second. First, a couple of things. One, we still have Discord community patches available for purchase. I'm not sure how much longer we're going to keep them available. We do have a few in stock, so if you want one signed or unsigned, you can order. The link is in the description. It's on the Discord. You can find it basically wherever. They're nice PVC patches. We've had orders from them all around the world. So if you don't have yours yet, definitely consider getting one.
I just realizing
the price
I forgot
includes
to get
shipping.
one from you when I was there this week.
Yeah,
twice.
Yeah, that was a rookie move. But yeah, so the price includes shipping all around the world. So $15 Canadian, whatever that works out to your currency. And you get your patch. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I wanted to give you a quick update on Bill C-21, the bill that is being considered by the federal government in Canada, which would have a tremendously negative impact on airsoft here. Now, if you're a returning listener, this is a frequent topic that we've talked about over the last year or so, and one that obviously we are closely following because, like I said, it would have a tremendously negative impact on airsoft.
It's one of those things we pay a fair amount of attention to.
Yeah. So to give you a bit of an update, and if you're not totally up on the bill, like it's not a big deal unless you're Canadian, in which case it is a big deal. But let's suffice it to say that the bill has been referred to the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. That was done last October. This is called the committee stage, where the committee actually studies the bill. And since then, the committee has heard from experts, has heard from people in the community. I submitted a brief personally. But late last year, the government actually introduced some very controversial amendments which have occupied almost all of the committee's time. As I've said before, Bill C-21 primarily deals with real firearms, not airsoft, and the amendments that were introduced only affected real firearms owners. That being said, they were extremely unpopular, so much so that the amendments were withdrawn, which has now caused much of the committee's time to be used to discuss the effects of the withdrawn amendments and yada, yada, yada. So in point of fact, the bill itself, C-21 as it is, has not been discussed since December of 2022. Now, in addition to that, there have been other issues of national security that have arisen other than this bill, which have taken the committee's time, including supporting Finland's membership to NATO. So as a result, there's been no movement on C-21 whatsoever in Ottawa since early March. So I guess that's a really long way for me to say no news yet. Though it does seem like...
pattern.
Yeah, and it seems like there is a bit of a loss of momentum on the issue. When the bill was first introduced last fall, it seemed like the government of Canada really wanted to enable the bill to go through quickly, to get put in place. And they were saying stuff like, "Oh, it'll be, ready by Thanksgiving." That's Canadian Thanksgiving for you American listeners, so October. And then stuff has started to slow down, and they've slowed down even more, and now they've really slowed down. Now, there's still more than 2 years left in this government before the next election. So it's unlikely that this bill will die on paper like it did the last time. It's very, very unlikely. But it also feels like it just might be a while before we get any progress. So in the meantime, for us as airsofters, I guess we just get on with it.
One of the primary pieces of the current situation, as I understand it, is just that the amendments and their subsequent failure to be accepted and all of that has made this kind of a thing that the current government doesn't want to talk about too loudly at the moment. And so it's probably going to sit for a while.
Yeah, and to be completely honest, without getting into any politics or whatever, there's a few matters of national security that are being debated on the federal level right now in Canada, which I will spare you the details of. But this is the National Security Committee we're talking about. So, that stuff is likely going to be
more important things to do.
Than, C-21, and especially more important than dealing with the toy gun portion of a bill. So I recognize where we are on the priority on the totem pole, so to speak.
And very understandably, I think.
Yeah, it's it's going to be a while. So that being said, like I said, what that means for us is we are going to start getting on with our season and our airsoft season, because as we've discussed before, we haven't really started the season yet. That's going to start, given the amount of snow melt we've had here in the last couple of weeks. It's going to start, if not this weekend, probably next weekend. So Pat and I actually got together this past weekend and sometime during the last week to start transferring and completing the transfer of my AEG transformation, I should say, of my AEG into an HPA. So over the winter, I got, well, Pat got me a tank and a remote line and a reg for my birthday, which was so kind. But also kind of like, when your drug dealer gives you the first one for free. I feel like that's the sort of
Hey,
situation that we were dealing with here.
look, the drug dealer makes a profit. I just get to do more work.
That's right. That's true. Yeah. Um, but so what we ended up doing, so Pat gave me that. I was able to get a Kythera from Stefan, and so we put that together. So
Which was fun.
yeah, I thought today, yeah, and we was, it is always with us, like, it's just hanging out and talking about airsoft, and also sort of looking forward to what my gear setup's going to look like. So that's really what today's episode is going to be about. It's going to be sort of what the trials and tribulations were
What
of
have we done to
putting.
Phil's airsoft gun?
Yeah, and like, what is the difference between what Pat has done with his HPA in terms of, getting a body that is suited for the engine, et cetera, which we'll get to in a second, and then what I did, which is taking what I already have, a form factor that I'm already familiar with, and trying to make the HPA work in that. And if that's what you're considering doing, you, the listener, what might you expect to see happen down the road as you go through that? And then I also want to talk about what my gear is going to look like, and some of the things that, I mean, I'm going to be making a full video on sort of my gear overview for the year. But having recently done a whole pile of ready ups with a new kit, talk about what that's going to look like, what that feels like, and again, some of the things, if you're going HPA for the first time, that you may want to consider. So let's jump right in. So let's start with I guess at the beginning, which is, what were we going from? So Pat, a bit more about, I would say, my own airsoft gun than I do. So what exactly was? Can you remind me? Like, we were going from a King Arms, right? Like an
So,
M4.
what we started with when we built the rifle was a King Arms M4, just your standard King Arms metal body. Uh, it came with, your standard M4 plastic foregrip and stock, which we got rid of pretty much immediately. So it's got a Mark II style um, rail system on it. I can't remember the exact brand.
Yeah, it's like one of the quad rails or
Yeah,
whatever.
it's your standard
Yeah.
sort of quad rail. I
Is
bought
it
it.
Block 2? Is that what they call
Yeah,
it?
that's what I'm saying. Like, I think it's a Block 2, but I bought it like 10 years ago or 8 years ago. I could actually go figure out the exact one. If anyone really needs to know, just drop me a message and I'll figure it out. It'll only take me a couple minutes.
Yeah, go make some work for Pat.
It is a popular thing. um, so, yeah, nothing too fancy there. It's got a really tiny 2-inch barrel extension because I wanted to put a 455mm barrel in it when I built it, which is still the length that we're using for it because it works fine. We did change the barrel out when we were tinkering with it this weekend, but we'll come to that. Internally, we had a Lonex gearbox with bearing bushings, 16-to-1 ratio Lonex gears, a modified piston and piston, or cylinder and cylinder head, a Lonex piston, a modified piston head, a Lonex, I think, because we had trouble with the previous one, nozzle, the standard tappet plate, and a Spectre Mark II Bluetooth MOSFET in it. So it was pretty tuned up. It should have been shooting 410-ish FPS with 0.2s, but it was being finicky and annoying the hell out of Phil and me.
Yeah, a couple of things to mention. The hop up was a Max
Yes.
M4 hop up Sport, so not the one with the latch that holds the BBs. Number one,
Yeah.
which is a great hop up. Like, it's tremendous, but it's really finicky. And I was having feeding issues, which is not something that should happen with those, and it was just driving me
Yeah,
crazy.
the drawback
And
to really, really precision manufactured hop up units is that then you need to match stuff to them, and we were having a lot of trouble with that. And it's weird because I had run a Kythera with one of those and had no issues,
mhm.
and I'd run the M4 with one and had no issues. So it was just sort of um, irritating me.
And then the other piece, which is not something that you really experienced as much as I would, but the motor would get very hot. And part of that was, I think, shimming on the gearbox, which we did correct once.
Yeah,
But
at some
even
point
still,
at some point when it was getting maintained, one of the shims had gotten swapped around, and that was part of the problem.
almost 100% my fault. I'm guaranteed I did that. But regardless, even when we fixed it, the motor was still getting really hot. And so I was at a point in my thinking where I'm like, this, and I'm sure I've said this on the podcast before. Like, I don't like the fact that if I shoot, my airsoft gun at a rate that I feel like I should be shooting it at, it's still the grip is getting hot. And yeah, people, we've often, it's a meme like Phil shoots a million BBs and all this kind of stuff. But I've seen how some of y'all play airsoft, and I've seen some of the videos that get shared on our channel, and they shoot just as much as I do. And I have difficulty believing in my thinking that a lot of those guns were getting as hot as mine was, like realistically, right?
I mean, certainly,
So
I
yeah.
have run literally the same build and not had that issue, even when I was shooting quite a lot. Like I've had the grip get a little bit warm when I was shooting a lot, but not toasty.
Yeah, and the whole start stop and all this kind of stuff. But again, like even for me, I've shot it a whole lot and it didn't always get that warm. So all of this sort of amounted to the fact that, well, I'm getting frustrated with this. And then I use Pat's HPA a whole bunch, which we talked about on the podcast before, which I'm not going to rehash. But that sort of crystallized, okay, well, let's proceed with this. And so our objective over the last, well, like let's say we've been trying to get this done for like 3 months, but because we're basically adults, it's impossible for us to find time to actually do stuff aside from this, which we both do from our houses. Like
Yeah.
getting together to do stuff is hard. So it took us a while to get together to do it. But basically, the operation was, in my mind, extract gearbox, put new stuff in, hooray, celebrate. That's how my mind worked on this, which shows you A, maybe perhaps that I'm a little too optimistic, but B, I have no idea what I'm getting into.
And I mean, one of the
Which
nice
proved to be
things
correct.
about the Kythera setup is that once it's done, it requires very little care and feeding. Right? Take it apart every now and then, lube it, put it back together. Good. The drawback to the Kythera is that the steps before that are somewhat fiddly at times. So I knew going into this that Polar Star designs their stuff to fit into VFC guns. So when I was running the Kythera, I had acquired the M27, which is a VFC gun. I just put it in. It was fine, right? It had no issues with alignment. It had no issues with fitment. Everything worked great. I hadn't put one into King Arms before, so I wasn't certain how the fitment would go. I knew I was going to have to modify the mech box a little bit, but initially my hope was actually that I could just use the VFC gearbox in the King Arms because I hadn't tried doing that before. And I was sort of like, well, we'll go and we'll take we did the sort of your basic maintenance on the Kythera. We took it apart, we lubed it up, we put it back together, made sure it was still, shooting good.
Pat is very generously saying we here. He means him. I was sort of moral support. And also, oh, can you hold this? Oh, can you put your finger there? Can you hold this for me for a second? I'm going to walk away now so I don't smash something. Can you make sure nothing falls over? Like that was me. That was Pat talking to me basically for those 2 days. But
I mean,
anyways, carry on.
in fairness, like you underestimate how valuable just having someone to hang out is. Really, like
Maybe.
For my sanity. But yeah, so the VFC gearbox didn't fit. Is the long and short of that.
Yeah.
So I was like, well, I guess I'll have to modify another one. I have King Arms gearboxes because I've built a lot of King Arms rifles. I put one in Phil's gun, and I think I still have 4. just sort of sitting
And I
around.
think it's worth noting here because I don't think I explicitly said it, but the whole purpose of us taking the gearbox out sort of in one piece, the AEG gearbox, is to leave it in one piece. If for some reason I were to not like HPA at all, which I'm finding increasingly unlikely as I use it, at least in my drills, we'll see how when I hit the field. But also just in case something goes wrong or whatever, I still have this fallback where I can throw the gearbox back in the gun, throw a motor in there, and then Bob's your uncle, so to speak. So otherwise, we could have ostensibly used the Lonex gearbox, perhaps
Yep.
instead, and saved ourselves a bunch of trouble. But
Yeah,
that wasn't part of the plan.
and that might have been in some ways an easier play, but like ultimately, I had either way to trim down a gearbox. So if you haven't installed the Kythera before, there are two little nubs on the inside of the front of the gearbox that lock the cylinder head in place. Those have to be shortened so that they don't crush the Kythera.
Mhm.
Or alternately so that you can close the gearbox without damaging it. This is not brutal, like it's not an awful thing to have to do, but it does take a little bit of doing. Fortunately, I'm pretty well equipped with the tools I need to do that, but it did mean that I was doing this over 2 days because it was easier to take it home than try to mess around with it at Phil's. um, and that's just really a matter of I have a really nice rotary tool, and it's very precision, and that is helpful. Or I'm really picky. Take your choice, right? Both have value here.
Yeah, your rotary tool is nicer. Like it's offset, right? Mine is just like a Dremel or whatever. So like that's I mean it's a fair thing. And I think there's just as a side note here, I think there's a piece um that goes without saying. Like making sure that you have the right tools for the job is really important. And you can make do with certain things. So for example, if you don't have a really long handle or a long neck screwdriver for the buffer tube screw or whatever, yeah, like you can make something work. But when it comes to really like precision tools, like if you're trying to use a micrometer for fitment or like there's no real substitute, you need to make sure that you have the things that you're going to need. And sometimes, in my case at least, if I had done this without Pat, I would have had to watch a lot of tutorials and get educated. Otherwise, I would not have known what I needed to do.
And
Right?
the reality is that you know I did that part already, right? When
Yeah,
I
yeah.
when I had my Kythera, I went through the non-trivial process of getting it to work. Um, Learned a bunch of stuff about how they work. It was great. Frustrating as hell at the time, to be completely honest. Like there were parts of it where I was just like, oh, I must go away from this and not smash gun. um,
Yeah.
the downside to doing all of these things in a workshop with good tools is I also have good hammers. But the so that piece of the fitment went pretty well. It wasn't too hard. I have a micrometer, so I just sort of did the measurements and gently carved out the component spaces and stuff. Um, so that wasn't too bad, other than it requiring me taking it home and bringing it back. Um, and then we put it all together and put it into the body. And we had a couple of issues with me using screws from a different gearbox type that were too fat and getting caught on the furniture inside the King Arms gun, which,
That was so
oh
frustrating.
my God.
But, to be honest, like that to me is like the airsoft teching experience. Like you put something in and for some reason it won't come apart. And it's like, what am I supposed to do here? I also incidentally don't have a rubber mallet. I've been wanting to buy one for a while, but never had like a good excuse. And I guess the excuse is past, but I'm still gonna get one
No,
now
like they're
because
they're
like
like $12. It's a tool worth having.
yeah,
Like,
but like this is where we were for a period of time. Like Pat and I were both like yanking on this to the top the upper and the lower I should say to try and get them apart, and it's just there's a metal piece that's impinging that, and like we're not going to shear that, the two of us, like we're gronks but we're not that strong, right? So like, and to me like that was like the epitome of an example of just what happens with airsoft teching sometimes. Like you just put something together, it's like, why is this not working the way it needs to, right?
yep.
Now thankfully Pat has more experience than I do and was able to figure out exactly where to apply a little bit of not torque surely, but a little twist to get the screw loose so that we could pop the whole thing
Yeah,
apart and then
a
swap
little
them,
bit of
right?
leverage to just space the upper apart a tiny bit,
Yeah.
because there is a little bit of give there. And
But you're talking about like not even 1 millimeter of play,
oh,
right?
totally.
That's how
You
tight
know,
some of these tolerances
it
are,
was,
right?
and to be honest, the reason I know how to do it is that I've done it before, because I've screwed that up before. Because the King Arms gearbox is like, yeah, that screw's too fat. Just
Yeah.
suffer. Um, so, uh, yeah, once it was in, Phil was like, yeah, we'll shoot it now. And I was like, well, we're going to check the nozzle alignment first. And Phil sort of, bleh.
Yeah.
um,
I had heard of this fabled nozzle alignment business, but I'd never
um,
really seen firsthand what that was like until Pat showed it to me, and he's like, "Hey, look, it's not aligned." And you look down the barrel, you're like, "Oh, it's not aligned." Yeah.
yeah, so it's not hard to align the nozzle of a Kythera. It's guess and check. So it's in this case, it was shoved way over to one side. So it's all right. Well, we'll go back into the gearbox and we'll use a bit of duct tape to shim it, because it isn't like, it looks like a big gap when you're staring down the barrel,
Hmm.
but it really is like way less than a millimeter. So we tried that, and it aligned it well enough to test, and it's firing really nicely. It's very crisp. Phil seems happy with the trigger response.
Yeah,
Um,
I was going to talk about that a little bit later, but yeah, we'll talk about
you
that
know,
after.
one of the things you can do before Phil gets into it, I'll find out what he thinks after. Spoilers. Um,
Mhm.
so you can adjust screws in the trigger component of the Kythera engine, which is a mechanical HPA engine rather than an electric one, if you don't know that. Um, and the result is you can really manipulate the trigger response quite a lot if you have the time and patience to mess around with it. I hate doing it. Largely, I hate doing it because I spent about 10 hours doing it with mine before realizing that, and the more mechanically adept folks in the audience are going to laugh at me, before realizing that there are multiple colors of Loctite and that that's important. Um, Essentially, the Loctite I was using was not adequate to actually lock the screws in, and therefore they were just coming out of alignment every time I pulled the trigger, which was infuriating.
Yeah.
Did eventually figure it out, did eventually square it away. It's fine, but it means that you can adjust the Kythera to be a fairly hair trigger, or to have some pull on it, whichever you prefer. And you can really season to taste. We did not adjust it much from where it was when it arrived in Phil's possession, because frankly, he needs to figure out what he thinks of it before we change anything. We have not, as yet, done a whole lot of long range testing. It feeds great. It's definitely getting good muzzle velocity. It's working well. But in terms of taking it out and putting rounds down range at a distance to see how the R hop and everything are performing, we haven't. So it may still need some fine tuning of the nozzle alignment. That's on the table. I'm hoping we got it right. um,
Yeah, and there's no real way to know one until we get out there
yeah, it's
and
just a matter of
actually
like taking it
shoot
to
it.
somewhere
Yeah.
where we can put it, down an actual distance of range, right? Like, we just currently lack a indoor facility that's 200 feet long that will let us go shoot our airsoft guns. Sadly, that would
Yeah.
be great.
And coming back to the trigger for a second, like I think one of the things that I really like about the trigger on the Kythera is, what I had previously was the Spectre MOSFET, which really is just a switch, right? So whether you're on safe, semi, full, doesn't matter. The travel distance is always the same, and it's not very big. So I'm pulling the trigger and I'm squeezing and I'm just whatever. Whereas it's not like that on, let's say, like a real firearm, for example. And we don't really talk about real firearms, but there's one thing that I really appreciate, and I really appreciated uh, in my time when I was doing like Olympic shooting and stuff like that, um, was like a trigger, like a hard trigger reset, right? And so on the Kythera, when you pull the slack on the trigger, I mean, all of you people who watched like Flannel Daddy Grantham will know about like ghosting the trigger. Like there is a wall, and when you hit that wall, you push through and it clicks and it fires. And then when you slightly release it, you can feel a mechanical reset in your finger.
Yep. And that is a very
And
pleasant
then
aspect of the Kythera.
yeah, and like you don't, once you're there, like you don't need to pull it back all the way forward and then all the way back. Like you can go back to reset and fire, back to reset and fire, which is super, like for me anyway, from a tactile perspective, and like from like, I guess I don't know what the right word is, but like it just feels very good and it feels very natural, right? Where on an AEG, especially on my AEG, like that's not a thing. Like you pull the trigger and there is no reset like click or anything like that, right? And I guess if you're firing an AG with like an actual shuttle or whatever, it's not supposed to click either, in my understanding, anyway.
It shouldn't.
So mechanically, when I was doing my ready ups today, I was like, man, I'm so jazzed about this. Like this is great. Like I'm coming up on target, I'm squeezing that trigger, I'm getting that little puff of air or whatever, and then I mechanically just reset my finger. I was like, oh yeah, this is nice.
The Kythera
like
trigger does feel
bueno.
Good. Like honestly,
yeah.
I have done different things with my gun since the Kythera, but no one suggests that I did it because I didn't think the Kythera was extremely fun to run or good.
Mm-hmm.
Like both of those things are untrue. Like I thought it was fantastic. To be honest, I put the Fusion engine in my M27 because my M27 not shooting in full auto annoyed me from a verisimilitude point of view, which is a daft thing, but I'm like that. It's also worth noting, so we also put a 6.01 barrel, Lambda one, I believe, into Phil's gun. So he's got the same hop-up unit and hop-up rubber that he had before, the same bucking, but his barrel is new. It's got an Elvish Tack R-Hop patch in it because we found those to be great so far. They're as good as doing the R-Hop the hard way and also are much easier.
Yeah, I was gonna say half the time. Excuse me. I was gonna say half the time, but like I'd say it's way less than that. Like it's like
fractional.
1/10 of the time. Yeah,
it's really good.
I mean, 1/2 is still a fraction.
Well, yes, but look, I don't teach math for obvious reasons.
Yeah, clearly. 1/2 is bigger than 1/3, right? Anyways, continue. Carry on.
No. So the outcome there is, we wanted to test out 6.1 barrels. We also, courtesy of some advice from the Discord, tried our hand at polishing them, which is essentially what Phil did for that afternoon, was polish a couple of barrels.
Yeah.
I gotta say, at least from like having a look at the polish of the barrel, oh, it's shinier kind of thing, it definitely did improve that. The internal polish of the barrel is a lot nicer than it was. It's actually probably at this point a little brighter and a little more fine than the Prometheus ones that we were using. So it'll be really interesting to see how that works out.
Yeah.
Again, once we get it out to test it.
I think it's worth noting that from the point of view of people who are chasing like absolute perfection from an HPA setup, a Kythera on a 6.01 millimeter barrel is not the ideal setup. In talking to some of the guys on the Discord, Koro in particular was mentioning to me that really the best barrel to use with a Kythera, like in the way we have it set up, is a 6.03 millimeter barrel. And there's a bunch of volume reasons and stuff like that, which I'm not smart enough
Physics.
to explain. I don't understand them. He explained them to me. I would have to basically read you what he said. But suffice it to say that one of the things that we're trying to really understand is what is the difference between the 6.01, what is the difference with the polishing. For the polishing, like all we did was follow a lot of the like YouTube videos that you can see on it, where you basically just add polish to like cleaning rags or whatever, and then we took the unjamming rod, mounted it on a drill, and just basically drilled the polish through the barrel for many minutes until the barrel would start to get warm, and then we would clean it out and then sort of repeat the process. And like Pat was saying, the finish, like observably the finish on the polish is a little bit better. If it's actually nicer a polish than the Prometheus barrel, I'm not Sure. Again, we're just dipping our toes into the world of like barrel polishing and all this kind of stuff. But there is a visual difference in the non-polished and the polished lambda. How much further you can take that, I'm sure. Like we just use one single polishing compound. I think it's called like Mothers or something like that, which I got on Amazon. You could probably take that down to even further and further and further. Um, Again, we are just starting on this journey of looking at this kind of stuff. There is almost certainly going to be a point of diminishing returns where you spend, let's say another hour polishing a barrel and the performance gain that you get is like 1%, right? But how you measure that performance gain and all this kind of stuff is going to be rather subjective in some cases.
And, you know,
Um,
ultimately, we'll let you know
so,
if we think it was worth it. You know, both the 6.01 and the polish. Because, I mean, if it
mhm.
turns out that the 6.01 is great in my Fusion engine, which it should be, but not as great in Phil's Kythera, we'll just put the previous barrel back in, right?
Yeah,
And we
that's right.
have very easy availability to do that and test it, and we'll play with it, you know. Um, so this means that over the next 2 months, if we're being realistic, one of our things that we're going to end up doing is tinkering with Phil's gun some more. So even if everything is aligned properly, we're at minimum going to go, okay, how does this shoot? And if Phil goes, this shoots fantastic, I'm pleased. Great. And if not, we'll mess around with it. You know, I'm fine either way.
Yeah.
You know, the key goal is just to make it satisfying for him to shoot, really. So at this point, it is, I think, again, quite a nice build. We're not trying to really, eke that like tiniest minuscule piece of performance upgrade out of it at this point. So much as we are just sort of going, okay, well, we know this should be super consistent in terms of its muzzle energy. We know it should be pretty spot on as far as the air hop goes. So assuming that that is the case, once we wear in the Elvish Tack patch, because you need to shoot about 100, 200 rounds through them to get them just sort of
So like 5 minutes.
functional. Yeah. Um, it should be pretty good. So
Yeah.
my hope is that what we've done is we've built Phil a gun that's going to serve him really well this season. We've definitely built a gun that has a lot more ease of tuning on some things. Like Phil's not going to have a thing where, like a situation, and I'm still a little bit flummoxed as to how this was happening. And I have days when I do want to blame the chronograph in question, but Phil had situations last season where he showed up and was like, "Oh, I'm over," and I'm like, "We haven't changed anything. You were fine last week. That shouldn't be a thing,
Yeah.
right? Like environmental changes here aren't really adequate to cause that problem. What the hell?" um, so, the big upshot for this is that won't happen with this. It's just not a
Yeah.
thing, right? If he shows up and his FPS is hugely over what it was the previous week, there's an issue with his regulator. Full stop. Right?
Yeah.
And we'll be able to look at the regulator and go, that number is wrong. Okay. Um,
So there's definitely some adaptations for me in terms of like bringing that type of kit to a game and utilizing, because I've never really done that before. And so some of the conversations that Pat and I were talking about is like, what about spare O-rings? What about spare lines? I mean, it turns out Pat has a lot of these spares anyway, by virtue of the fact that he's been doing HPA for, longer than the hot minute I've been doing it for.
Also,
Um,
I've done enough teching that I'm paranoid. So if I order a thing and I'm like,
yeah.
oh, this doesn't have spare O-rings, internet.
But if you're looking at HPA for yourself, I would say the old saying of like two is one and one is none is definitely a good way to think about it, because unlike an AEG, for example, if you go to the game and your battery like catches fire or whatever, just get a different battery. But if your hose goes, unless you have another hose, like you're not, it's unlikely that someone else at the field is just hanging around, unless it's me and Pat, in which case he definitely does have a spare for me. But like an average random person is not going to be able to go like, oh, here's a hose,
And
right?
in
So it's
fairness,
something to consider.
I don't actually have a spare hose. I have the hose that I'm using on my guns, and you have what was my spare one.
Well, I guess we need another hose
You
then.
know, but the upshot is, so we're using nice Kevlar covered, braided lines, which are quite durable. And like, yeah, the idea of having a spare is sufficiently good that I'll probably toss one onto the cart that I have waiting for me to get paid again. Um,
Hmm.
budgets, but um, like it is a good idea to have one, but unless there's visible wear on it, which there definitely isn't on yours because I checked this weekend, and there definitely isn't on mine because it's not new old enough to have that issue, but also because I did check it when I did my check for preseason stuff a couple of weeks ago. So that shouldn't be an issue this season at all. Like, it would be really bloody weird, but you are right that it's a good idea just to buy a spare one and have it tucked away, because they don't really degrade as such. It is a hose, and if it
Yeah.
degrades, it's like, oh, I've had this for 15 years. Yeah, if you had your spare airsoft hose for 15 years, great. Buy a new one, but great, or at least check it. Um,
So now, so now the real challenge sort of begins. Like the hard part, so to speak, is done. I mean, we've have some more teching and fine tuning likely in our future, as Pat was saying, with respect to making sure that everything works fine, etc. However, now I need to start getting used to using the HPA, and as we've talked about before, it's not just the HPA; it's the fact that I'm using a new barrel, which is going to have different performance metrics. I'm using the HPA, but I need to a tank. Right, to carry my tank somewhere, so I'm going to be using a backpack, like a very small, like repurposed hydration carrier. Right, that's going to be my first trial, so I'm going to have a little bit more kit on than before. I'm not worried about like the weight as such, but something to consider. Then I need to think about how is that optimized to make sure it's not like rattling around and all this kind of stuff. And then also I've got to manage the line. Like, is that going to be a problem? Is it going to be a problem if I switch shoulders? All this kind of stuff. And on top of everything else, I have a new speaker mic for this season to replace my old crappy one, and I have a new optic, right? Because I've got the the Hollow
yep.
Sun, right?
Yeah, I've
So all of those things together combined for Phil's got a lot of learning to do this year, right? So yeah, and so I've been doing ready ups. I mentioned before, like I did some ready ups even just this evening to see like what is it like with the line? Is it a problem? The good news on that score is actually I had no issues with transitions whatsoever. I have the line running through the shoulder strap of the actual like backpack thing that I have. It has some sort of like utility buckle that people hang stuff on, like keys or whatever. And I have the line. Interestingly, it only goes in one way, so I have to disconnect it from the reg and then run it up through the thing and then into the reg again. The other way, it's too fat; it won't fit. But regardless, so it works, and then it connects down and into my gun, and it's out of the way. And when I transition, when I bump, like it's not getting in the way, it's not getting caught. It's perfectly long enough. Like that's not an issue. Because I mean, if you think about it, the line is coming out, let's say around like here. It just has to go like over,
yeah, and you've got
right? So that part is not hard, right?
and you're using the shorter of the two, because the reason I had a spare ultimately was that I bought a short one and was like, this is okay, but I'm an orangutan, maybe I will try a long one. So the next time I ordered one, I was like, yeah, they're $30, whatever, and got a
Yeah,
longer
and the
one, and
short one is
I
fine for
liked
me
the longer one.
because
Okay, yeah, checks out.
yeah, and the short one is fine for me because I'm a junior mint, right? Like it's fine. Like it has like it's two inches difference from one side to the other. It's fine. So all that being said, it's been really that part's been a non-issue. One of the things that I've been trying to do, this is a tip that I got from Todd actually on the Discord, is using like pool noodles in the backpack to sort of wedge in the
Yeah, thanks, I'm stealing that idea,
tank.
Mike.
I had some acoustic foam panels that had been shredded and like mangled and stuff, so I can't really use them on the wall. But I was thinking, well, it's flexible, it's soft, so I'm just gonna wrap it around the tank and put it in the pack and see if that works. And that's okay. But like when I was doing transitions and I was like, kneeling, or like I could feel the pack sort of twist on my back, and I could really feel the tank against my back. And I'm like, okay, I want to put like another layer or something in there to mitigate it. Um, so that part is fine. And then the other thing is, and I think I mentioned it on the podcast before, but we've been talking about it on Discord. It's 100% confirmed. I and John are going to Iron Horse next year. Like that is 100% happening. And part of that means that now John and I, are going to take this season really seriously in terms of practicing, growing our skills, communication, teamwork, all this kind of stuff. But Iron Horse means that we need to think about what our kit setups are going to be like when we're going around the field, etc. But also the types of things that we need to carry. And lights are one thing that we're going to need to make sure are on our airsoft replicas. And so having a weapon light is going to be very important. And
I know you had a
I
really
have
nice one
one,
back in the day.
and I have one. I have a like an Inforce weapon light replica, I think,
Yeah,
and
that
it's
is the one I
fine.
remember.
Like it's streamlined, like it's great. But I've never put it on my airsoft gun, so now I've got to put it on there. I need to start practicing with it. Think about stuff like light discipline. Think about how I'm actually going to manipulate it, and also one of the things that we're going to want to do is record our time down at Iron Horse, right? I'm not going down there and not taking video footage, even if y'all don't see it because I was horrible. It's still an experience that I want to
That
have
means we're gonna have
recorded.
to strap a
And
GoPro to Johnny too.
yeah, well, we're gonna have to strap a GoPro to Johnny, absolutely. But again, other things, other considerations are like, what do I still like? Do I want to run the same setup that I always do for that? Do I want to do something different? Do I want to drill a hole in my case and use a battery bank on my helmet? Do I want to have multiple batteries? Like all of this kind of stuff now needs to get incorporated into the routine. So because it kind of reminds me of like when I used to do wedding photography or whatever. You only get one shot,
Yeah.
right? Everything has to be like rock solid because you're not going to get a second opportunity doing this.
Which
So
means that
if,
this
for
summer we
example,
get
and
to
I've
mess
had,
around.
well, we do, and I need to make sure that some of the stuff that we're going to do, especially from an AV point of view and like recording and stuff, is on lock. So like there have been times where I've gone to the field and I've hit record and it didn't record, it took a picture. That cannot happen at Iron
Yeah,
Horse,
that would
right?
be no
Like that
bueno.
kind of stuff cannot happen. So there's a lot of that comes into it. And so to come back to the HPA bit, all of this now needs to rope into my regular practice because it's one thing for us to hit the field and play, and Johnny and I are going to play a lot together this year and really get that locked down. But all the rest of it also needs to come with that, right?
Definitely. So, I mean, my end of that is largely being a facilitator, really.
Well, and I'm not taking my airsoft gun to the States because it'll get in, but it will never come back with
Yeah,
me.
exactly.
So, people on Discord, like Chaz and stuff, they're gonna figure something out. We'll work together on that. But regardless, all of the skills that I'm gonna practice this year are really gonna culminate to that. And we need to be like good to go because Iron Horse, I think, is in like January or February, which means that we're gonna be a couple of months out
Rusty.
of, potentially, depending on what the winter looks like, a couple of months out of the season before we hit the field. So
Well, it'll be fun.
there's a bunch of that. It is going to be fun, but I'm really looking forward to a really big season of like growth, and HPA I think is going to be a huge part of that in different ways. Like I don't think it's going to be difficult. Like that part, I don't expect that, and I don't expect to have frustrations in the same way that I had with my AEG. Although maybe I'm deluding myself on that score.
So, I mean,
But
Steph and I have had basically no issues once we got them dialed in. Getting it dialed in might take us a little bit of time, and I know you well enough to know that you will find that irritating a couple of along the way, in the sense that I mean, maybe we'll get lucky and maybe it'll just be working great when we take it out and check it out. But there are very possible worlds where we take it out and test it, and it requires further adjustment. But I don't think any of that will be particularly gruesome. And it certainly won't take us more than the beginning of the season to get that aspect of it set up. One of the nice things about running the HPA setup this year, I think also is like, I know Chaz has more than one HPA setup as well. So like there are possible worlds where you empty your tank and just pack it. Right. Like,
well, and the other thing too, I think, because the gearbox, so to speak, on an HPA is not under tension, like I would feel a lot more comfortable opening that by myself.
well, it's super quick, as you saw
right?
from me doing it
Yeah.
4 or 5 times. It's super quick to just go boop boop. It's
Yeah,
very
like, and
easy.
I could look at it and be like, okay, so I'm just gonna take this part, and then Pat's gonna help guide me put back together whatever, and that part will be okay. I think I'm less concerned about that than I would have been with an AEG gearbox. Not that I'm not capable of doing it. You've seen me do it with limited supervision, um, but I always prefer to have you there just from a confidence standpoint, just in
And I
case.
mean, one of the nice things about the Kythera is that really, when you take the Kythera apart, like as we have it built right now, there's nothing that's going to leave spontaneously, right? Like
Hmm.
there is nothing in that gun that has the same like issue of just like, oh, I let go at the wrong time, so my uh, driving spring for my gun is now embedded in the wall of the workshop. Like, you
Yeah,
know,
yeah, exactly, exactly.
like
Yeah,
just you don't have that issue. And like I've reached the point where I'm not stressed about that. I am very, very accustomed to where all the springs are and what they should be doing with an airsoft gun. But like I have a lot of hours teching airsoft guns.
yeah,
And I
legit.
definitely remember, like there was a point where very early on in gun teching, where like people had made me so paranoid about like, oh, stuff flying everywhere when I took it apart that I was like working inside of like a Ziploc bag so that if it exploded, it wouldn't go too far. Because the workspace that I was teching in is very cluttered. Things that go away forever.
Hmm. Yep,
um,
yep,
and I'm long past that issue, but like I do remember being stressed about it, and it definitely is a benefit of it. I mean, one of the things I really like about the Fusion engine in mine is just I don't even have to take it out of the gun to do most of the basic maintenance on it. Like lubing it is like, yeah, take a couple of screws out, okay,
that's sweet.
don't
Yeah,
lose them. Um, so it's pleasant in that way. Like at some point, yours, mine, Steph's, all of the above will have issues with a seal, and we'll have to figure that out. But like, that's sort of the like, O-rings are disposable. They're not super
yeah,
expensive. I have spare ones for mine. I think we have spare Kythera ones as well. I'll have to check. But like ultimately, meh, it's not a huge issue. Um, and equally, like if yours does go down, I can just toss you one of my spare HPA guns and you can go, right? And like
yeah. That's the other
vice
nice
versa.
thing that I'm kind of, yeah, like I'm kind of excited. I mean, I put the holos on my rifle, and I've been, like I said, I was doing ready ups, and it's nice. But my SRS went to your Scorpion, right? So there is a world where you're using your M27, and I'm like, I'm using Scorpion this game because, lol, why
Yeah,
not,
totally.
right? Uh, or vice versa. You're like, Phil, I want to run your gun to this game because I want to see what that's like for whatever.
Yeah,
So
try out
like
the Hollow Sun
that,
and see how the
there's
Kythera is doing. Just
and it's not that we didn't do that before. However, if you're running HPA and I'm running AEG, it makes it harder to do that. Whereas now it's very simple. So I'm looking forward to be honest, like I am looking forward to some of that. Like I definitely wanted to try the Scorpion. So this is a great opportunity to do
yeah,
that now,
absolutely.
where it would have been a bit harder to do that
And like
previously.
once I still am working on putting away the money to HPA the LMG as well. So like that puts a third cool thing into the or fourth cool thing I should say into the mix of just like options we have, right?
Hmm.
And like swapping out my gear and letting you run it has worked pretty well. But like, let's be real, I'm wearing a much bigger backpack than you're going to be comfortable with because I'm an ogre. It is sized for me, so it is sized for size ogre, and so like this should be significantly less fiddly. Like we might have to adjust your reg depending on we will have to adjust your reg depending on what we're like switching to. But like one of the things I'm planning on doing is just making sure that my kit has a I might actually just like tape a piece of paper onto my HPA bottle and just be like, okay, um, you know, pressure,
These are the
yeah,
settings for,
pressure
yeah.
equals X for X FPS or X joules on Scorpion. Ditto for each of the guns, so that it's just like, oh yeah, done.
That's actually a very clever idea, Pat. I'm impressed.
Just I have them every now and then just to confuse people.
Yeah, no, don't hurt yourself, but yeah.
Look, if you were here, you'd be able to smell the smoke. It's fine.
The gears are just like just blocked. But yeah, I think that's a really good way for us to do that. But anyways, that's a problem for future us. I think ultimately I'm excited about the premise of HPA and the premise of like new learning. It's not as well that like airsoft has gotten stale or anything like that, but it's fun to have a bit of a new challenge every now and then, or a new set of skills to develop. And I don't really know that it's going to be hard skills quite as much. I think there's going to be a lot more like tinkering and learning the you know the gear setup and all that kind of stuff. Like I'm not sure if I like the backpack that I have. Like all of those things, I'm only going to start learning once we actually hit the
And like,
field and play around.
definitely, and like one of the things that I think is rad about this in a general sense is, like the thing that makes this super fun for me. It's like, oh man, like this is cool new toys, right? For you,
Yeah.
for me, like the Scorpion I got so late last season that I have fielded it once, and I did not have the optic dialed in, like, so it'll be really cool to see how that performs. I've got a new hop up unit for it. I'm gonna have a new barrel for it before really the season gets going. So like that's gonna be minty. I think HPAing the LMG is also going to be bloody hilarious once it occurs. That's probably a later in the summer kind of gig, but like, it'll be a laugh. Um,
Hmm.
and I think the outcome really is, yeah, you have a lot to be excited about because you have a very different, very cool, satisfying to play with toy that is, distinct from the previous iteration of it in a bunch of ways. And like, I think you're going to have a bunch of stuff to figure out because you have I mean, you have new optic, light, different like physical setup of stuff on the gun than what you ran
Yeah,
last year.
100%.
But I don't think ultimately like it's going to take a little bit of dialing in probably. But I think that once it's it's tuned and it's rocking, I think that you're going to find the Kythera performs really, really well. I think you're going to find that very fun. Like I mean, I haven't been shy about it. Like I bought the Kythera, I ran the Kythera for a season. I said, that's awesome. I want to see what the full meal deal, the really expensive version is. I've run that for a season. It's also awesome. I think there are benefits to both versions. The trigger pull isn't as satisfying on the Fusion engine. On the other hand, being able to like hot adjust all the settings on the thing until it does exactly what I want it to is basically where I'm at. It's like, yes, good.
Yeah, just throw money at the
I
problem.
mean, that
Yeah.
is pretty much what I did. The stupid part of it is I threw money at a problem that didn't exist, um, in the sense that the Kythera was fantastic, whatever. But I have zero regrets about the outcome, so whatevs. um,
I will say, I've said it before, that Kythera trigger is really nice.
yep.
So,
So it's a lot of fun. You know, But one thing I was going to say is also like you said you were going to do a sort of like this is Phil's kit for the start of the season kind of thing. It might be
mhm.
cool to do that with me and John as well. I don't know, like just to be like, yeah, this is what
Yeah.
I'm currently planning on running. I've got a couple of new things kicking around as well. Scorpion, I picked up a Avatar grenade. Um, they're
Oh yeah, yeah. You were showing me that. We've got a few things that we need to talk about
yeah, we'll save that
in
save
the
that for
future.
a future sort of thing. But yeah, like I'd be happy to rattle through what I'm running. Not a lot of my like vest and stuff that hasn't changed and isn't going to because I'm super happy with it. But I've got 3 guns currently running. One not entirely functional, sort of finished LMG build, um, which is like the Scorpion, which was actually pretty nice before I got parts to put in it, so it should be really nice now. I'm thinking, and the M27 is just beautiful. So you know,
Yeah. Well, I didn't want to volunteer for a video, but if
yeah,
you're
yeah, no,
suggesting
I
it, then
mean,
we'll.
I tend to avoid that, but I guess my uh, continual participation in these streamed versions of this is maybe making me a little less camera shy.
Nice.
Um,
Well,
you
that's
know,
good.
but yeah, that could be something fun to do.
Mhm.
I also, I'm kind of curious, like what you're gonna rig your gear up to do. So that'll be neat to see from Pat's point of view, because like, as I've said before, like how do you do a successful YouTube channel? You get someone else to do all the work. um,
Well, if we do a video together, I'll have to get an Apple box to sand on. Is all I'm saying. Because and I'll have to like put my camera up like an extra 3 feet to make sure that we can get all of you in the frame.
But yeah, I resemble Sweetums from the Muppets.
So we have a bit of tinkering left to do. We've got a little bit of comparison, all of which you guys will hear about on podcasts, for sure on podcasts, in videos as well. Maybe as we continue live streaming too. Definitely, you'll be hearing more of that. But I mean, that's really all that we want to talk about today. Give you a bit of an update on that and how that looks like. What the last couple of weeks have looked like for myself and Pat.
What have we been doing?
Yeah, that's yeah. But guys, thank you so much for listening. That's all we have for you this week. We really appreciate all of you being here and listening to our content. It really does make a big difference for us. So thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next week.
Have a great week, everyone.